Chapter 21 of Tik-Tok of Oz. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Matthew Hinman. Tik-Tok of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 21. A Bashful Brother.
With fast-beating hearts, they all rushed forward, and beyond a group of stately metal trees, came full upon a most astonishing scene. There was Ruggedo, in the hands of the officers of Oogaboo, a dozen of whom were clinging to the old gnome, and holding him fast in spite of his efforts to escape. There also was Queen Ann, looking grimly upon the scene of strife, but when she observed her former companions approaching, she turned away in a shamefaced manner. For Ann and her officers were indeed a sight to behold. Her Majesty's clothing, once so rich and gorgeous, was now worn and torn into shreds by her long crawl through the tunnel, which, by the way, had led her directly into the metal forest. It was indeed one of the 3 secret passages, and by far the most difficult of the 3. Anne had not only torn her pretty skirt and jacket, but her crown had become bent and battered, and even her shoes were so cut and slashed that they were ready to fall from her feet. The officers had fared somewhat worse than their leader, for holes were worn in the knees of their trousers, while sharp points of rock in the roof and sides of the tunnel had made rags of every inch of their once brilliant uniforms. A more tattered and woeful army never came out of a battle than these harmless victims of the rocky passage. But it had seemed their only means of escape from the cruel gnome king, so they had crawled on regardless of their sufferings. When they reached the metal forest, their eyes beheld more plunder than they had ever dreamed of. Yet they were prisoners in this huge dome, and could not escape with the riches heaped about them. Perhaps a more unhappy and homesick lot of conquerors never existed than this band from Oogaboo. After several days of wandering in their marvelous prison, they were frightened by the discovery that Ruggedo had come among them. Rendered desperate by their sad condition, the officers exhibited courage for the first time since they left home, and, ignorant of the fact that Ruggedo was no longer king of the gnomes, they threw themselves upon him, and had just succeeded in capturing him when their fellow adventurers reached the spot. "Goodness gracious!" cried Betsy. "What has happened to you all?" Anne came forward to greet them, sorrowful and indignant. "We were obliged to escape from the pit through a small tunnel, which was lined with sharp and jagged rocks," said she. "And not only was our clothing torn to rags, but our flesh is so bruised and sore that we are stiff and lame in every joint. To add to our troubles, we find we are still prisoners, but now that we have succeeded in capturing the wicked metal monarch, we shall force him to grant us our liberty." "Ruggedo is no longer metal monarch or king of the gnomes," Files informed her. "He has been deposed and cast out of his kingdom by Quox. But here is the new king, whose name is Calico, and I am pleased to assure your Majesty that he is our friend." "Glad to meet your Majesty, I'm sure," said Calico, bowing as courteously as if the queen still wore splendid raiment. The officers, having heard this explanation, now set Ruggedo free, but as he had no place to go, he stood by and faced his former servant, who is now king in his place, in a humble and pleading manner. "What are you doing here?" asked Calico sternly. "Why, I was promised as much treasure as I could carry in my pockets," replied Ruggedo, "so I came here to get it, not wishing to disturb your Majesty." "You are commanded to leave the country of the gnomes forever," declared Calico. "I know, and I'll go as soon as I have filled my pockets," said Ruggedo meekly. "Then fill them and be gone," returned the new king. Ruggedo obeyed. Stooping down, he began gathering up jewels by the handful and stuffing them into his many pockets. They were heavy things, these diamonds and rubies and emeralds and amethysts and the like, so before long Ruggedo was staggering with the weight he bore, while the pockets were not yet filled. When he could no longer stoop over without falling, Betsy and Polychrome and the Rose Princess came to his assistance, picking up the finest gems and tucking them into his pockets. At last these were all filled, and Ruggedo presented a comical sight, for surely no man ever before had so many pockets, or any at all filled with such a choice collection of precious stones. He neglected to thank the young ladies for their kindness, but gave them a surly nod of farewell, and staggered down the path by the way he had come. They let him depart in silence, for with all he had taken, the masses of jewels upon the ground seemed scarcely to have been disturbed, so numerous were they. Also they hoped they had seen the last of the degraded king. "I'm awful glad he's gone," said Betsy, sighing deeply. "If he doesn't get reckless and spend his wealth foolishly, he's got enough to start a bank when he gets to Oklahoma." "But my brother, my dear brother, where is he?" inquired Shaggy anxiously. "Have you seen him, Queen Anne?" "What does your brother look like?" asked the Queen. Shaggy hesitated to reply, but Betsy said, "He's called the Ugly One. Perhaps you'll know him by that." "The only person we have seen in this cavern," said Anne, "has run away from us whenever we approached him. He hides over yonder among the trees that are not gold, and we have never been able to catch sight of his face, so I cannot tell whether he is ugly or not." "That must be my dear brother!" exclaimed Shaggy. "Yes, it must be," assented Calico. "No one else inhabits this splendid dome, so there can be no mistake." "But why does he hide among those green trees, instead of enjoying all these glittery golden ones?" asked Betsy. "Because he finds food among the natural trees," replied Calico, "and I remember that he has built a little house there to sleep in. As for these glittery golden trees, I will admit they are very pretty at first sight. One cannot fail to admire them, as well as the rich jewels scattered beneath them, but if one has to look at them always, they become pretty tame." "I believe that is true," declared Shaggy. "My dear brother is very wise to prefer real trees to the imitation ones. But come, let us go there and find him." Shaggy started for the green grove at once, and the others followed him, being curious to witness the final rescue of his long-sought, long-lost brother. Not far from the edges of the grove they came upon a small hut, cleverly made of twigs and golden branches woven together. As they approached the place, they caught a glimpse of a form that darted into the hut and slammed the door tight shut after him. Shaggy Man ran to the door and cried aloud, "Brother! Brother!" "Who calls?" demanded a sad, hollow voice from within. "It is Shaggy, your own loving brother, who has been searching for you a long time and has now come to rescue you." "Too late," replied the gloomy voice. "No one can rescue me now." "Oh, but you are mistaken about that," said Shaggy. "There is a new king of the gnomes named Calico in Ruggedo's place, and he has promised you shall go free." "Free? I dare not go free," said the Ugly One in a voice of despair. "Why not, brother?" asked Shaggy anxiously. "Do you know what they have done to me?" came the answer through the closed door. "No. Tell me, brother, what have they done?" "When Ruggedo first captured me, I was very handsome. Don't you remember, Shaggy?" "Not very well, brother. You were so young when I left home, but I remember that Mother thought you were beautiful." "She was right. I am sure she was right," wailed the prisoner. "But Ruggedo wanted to injure me, to make me ugly in the eyes of all the world, so he performed a wicked enchantment. I went to bed beautiful, or you might say handsome. To be very modest, I will merely claim that I was good-looking, and I wakened the next morning the homeliest man in all the world. I am so repulsive that when I look in a mirror I frighten myself." "Poor brother," said Shaggy softly, and all the others were silent from sympathy. "I was so ashamed of my looks," continued the voice of Shaggy's brother, "that I tried to hide, but the cruel King Ruggedo forced me to appear before all the legion of gnomes, to whom he said, 'Behold the Ugly One!' But when the gnomes saw my face, they all fell to laughing and jeering, which prevented them from working at their tasks. Seeing this, Ruggedo became angry and pushed me into a tunnel, closing the rock entrance so that I could not get out. I followed the length of the tunnel until I reached this huge dome where the marvelous metal forest stands, and here I have remained ever since." "Poor brother," repeated Shaggy. "But I beg you now to come forth and face us, who are your friends. None here will laugh or jeer, however unhandsome you may be." "No, indeed," they all added pleadingly. But the Ugly One refused the invitation. "I cannot," said he. Indeed, I cannot face strangers, ugly as I am." Shaggy Man turned to the group surrounding him. "What shall I do?" he asked in sorrowful tones. "I cannot leave my dear brother here, and he refuses to come out of that house and face us." "I'll tell you," replied Betsy. "Let him put on a mask." "The very idea I was seeking!" exclaimed Shaggy joyfully, and then he called out, "Brother, put a mask over your face, and then none of us can see what your features are like." "I have no mask," answered the ugly one. "Look here," said Betsy, "he can use my handkerchief." Shaggy looked at the little square of cloth and shook his head. "It isn't big enough," he objected. "I'm sure it isn't big enough to hide a man's face, but he can use mine." Saying this, he took from his pocket his own handkerchief and went to the door of the hut. "Here, my brother," he said, "take this handkerchief and make a mask of it. I will also pass you my knife, so that you may cut holes for the eyes, and then you must tie it over your face." The door slowly opened, just far enough for the ugly one to thrust out his hand to take the handkerchief and the knife. Then it closed again. "Don't forget a hole for your nose," cried Betsy. "You must breathe, you know." For a time there was silence. Queen Anne and her army sat upon the ground to rest. Betsy sat on Hank's back. Polychrome danced lightly up and down the jeweled paths, while Files and the princess wandered through the groves arm in arm. Tik-Tok, who never tired, stood motionless. By and by a noise sounded from within the hut. "Are you ready?" asked Shaggy. "Yes, brother," came the reply, and the door was thrown open to allow the ugly one to step forth. Betsy might have laughed aloud had she not remembered how sensitive to ridicule Shaggy's brother was, for the handkerchief with which he had masked his features was a red one covered with big white polka dots. In this 2 holes had been cut in front of the eyes, while 2 smaller ones before the nostrils allowed the man to breathe freely. The cloth was then tightly drawn over the ugly one's face and knotted at the back of his neck. He was dressed in clothes that had once been good, but now were sadly worn and frayed. His silk stockings had holes in them, and his shoes were stub-toed and needed blackening. "But what can you expect," whispered Betsy, "when the poor man has been a prisoner for so many years?" Shaggy had darted forward and embraced his newly found brother with both his arms. The brother also embraced Shaggy, who then led him forward and introduced him to all the assembled company. "This is the new Gnome King," he said when he came to Calico. "He is our friend, and he has granted you your freedom." "That is a kindly deed," replied Ugly in a sad voice. "But I dread to go back to the world in this direful condition. Unless I remain forever masked, my dreadful face would curdle all the milk and stop all the clocks." "Can't the enchantment be broken in some way?" inquired Betsy. Shaggy looked anxiously at Calico, who shook his head. "I am sure I can't break the enchantment," he said. "Ruggedo is fond of magic and learned a good many enchantments that we gnomes know nothing of." "Perhaps Ruggedo himself might break his own enchantment," suggested Anne, "but unfortunately we have allowed the old king to escape." "Never mind, my dear brother," said Shaggy consolingly. "I am very happy to have found you again, although I may never see your face. So let us make the most of this joyful reunion."
The ugly one was affected to tears by this tender speech, and the tears began to wet the red handkerchief. So Shaggy gently wiped them away with his coat sleeve. End of chapter 21.
Chapter 22 of Tik-Tok of Oz. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ada Kerman. Chapter 22, Kindly Kisses. "Won't you be dreadful sorry to leave this lovely place?" Betsy asked the ugly one. "No, indeed," said he. "Jewels and gold are cold and heartless things, and I am sure I would presently have died of loneliness had I not found the natural forest at the edge of the artificial one. Anyhow, without these real trees I should soon have starved to death." Betsy looked around at the quaint trees. "I don't just understand that," she admitted. "What could you find to eat here?" "The best food in the world," Ugly answered. "Do you see that grove at your left?" He added, pointing it out, "Well, such trees as those do not grow in your country, or in any other place but this cavern. I have named them hotel trees because they bear a certain kind of table-tote fruit called three-course nuts. That's funny, said Betsy. What are the three-course nuts like? Something like coconuts to look at, explained the ugly one. All you have to do is to pick one of them and then sit down and eat your dinner. You first unscrew the top part and find a cupful of good soup. After you have eaten that, you unscrew the middle part and find a hollow filled with meat and potatoes, vegetables, and a fine salad. Eat that and unscrew the next section, and you come to the dessert in the bottom of the nut. That is, pie and cake, cheese and crackers, and nuts and raisins. The three-course nuts are not all exactly alike in flavor or in contents, but they are all good, and in each one may be found a complete three-course dinner. But how about breakfasts? Inquired Betsy. Why, there are breakfast trees for that, which grow over there at the right. They bear nuts, like the others, only the nuts contain coffee or chocolate instead of soup, oatmeal instead of meat and potatoes, and fruits instead of dessert. Sad as has been my life in this wonderful prison, I must admit that no one could live more luxuriously in the best hotel in the world than I have lived here. But I will be glad to get into the open air again and see the good old sun and the silvery moon and the soft green grass and the flowers that are kissed by the morning dew. Ah, how much more lovely are those blessed things than the glitter of gems or the cold gleam of gold. Of course, said Betsy. I once knew a little boy who wanted to catch the measles, because all the little boys in his neighborhood but him had 'em, and he was really unhappy because he couldn't catch 'em, try as he would. So I'm pretty certain that the things we want and can't have are not good for us. Isn't that true, Shaggy? Not always, my dear, he gravely replied. If we didn't want anything, we would never get anything, good or bad. I think our longings are natural, and if we act as nature prompts us, we can't go far wrong. For my part, said Queen Anne, I think the world would be a dreary place without the gold and jewels. All things are good in their way, said Shaggy, but we may have too much of any good thing. And I have noticed that the value of anything depends upon how scarce it is and how difficult it is to obtain. Pardon me for interrupting you, said King Calico, coming to their side, but now that we have rescued Shaggy's brother, I would like to return to my royal cavern. Being the king of the gnomes, it is my duty to look after my restless subjects and see that they behave themselves. So they all turned and began walking through the metal forest to the other side of the great domed cave where they had first entered it. Shaggy and his brother walked side by side, and both seemed rejoiced that they were together after their long separation. Betsy didn't dare look at the polka-dot handkerchief, for fear she would laugh aloud. So she walked behind the two brothers and led Hank by holding fast to his left ear. When at last they reached the place where the passage led to the outer world, Queen Anne said, in a hesitating way that was unusual with her, I have not conquered this gnome country, nor do I expect to do so, but I would like to gather a few of these pretty jewels before I leave this place. Help yourself, ma'am, said King Calico, and at once the officers of the army took advantage of his royal permission and began filling their pockets, while Anne tied a lot of diamonds in a big handkerchief. This accomplished, they all entered the passage, the gnomes going first to light the way with their torches. They had not proceeded far when Betsy exclaimed, Why, there are jewels here, too. All eyes were turned upon the ground, and they found a regular trail of jewels strewn along the rock floor. This is queer, said Calico, much surprised. I must send some of my gnomes to gather up these gems and replace them in the metal forest where they belong. I wonder how they came to be here. All the way along the passage they found this trail of jewels, but when they neared the end the mystery was explained. For there, squatted upon the floor with his back to the rock wall, sat old Ruggedo, puffing and blowing as if he was all tired out. Then they realized it was he who had scattered the jewels from his many pockets, which one by one had burst with the weight of their contents as he had stumbled along the passage. But I don't mind, said Ruggedo with a deep sigh. I now realize that I could not have carried such a weighty load very far, even had I managed to escape from this passage with it. The woman who sewed the pockets on my robe used poor thread, for which I shall thank her. Have you any jewels left? Inquired Betsy. He glanced into some of the remaining pockets. A few, said he, but they will be sufficient to supply my wants, and I no longer have any desire to be rich. If some of you will kindly help me to rise, I'll get out of here and leave you, for I know you all despise me and prefer my room to my company. Shaggy and Calico raised the old king to his feet when he was confronted by Shaggy's brother, whom he now noticed for the first time. The queer and unexpected appearance of the ugly one so startled Ruggedo that he gave a wild cry and began to tremble as if he had seen a ghost. Who is this? He faltered. I am that helpless prisoner whom your cruel magic transformed from a handsome man into an ugly one, answered Shaggy's brother in a voice of stern reproach. Really, Ruggedo, said Betsy, you ought to be ashamed of that mean trick. I am, my dear, admitted Ruggedo, who was now as meek and humble as formerly he had been cruel and vindictive. Then returned the girl, you'd better do some more magic and give the poor man his own face again. I wish I could, answered the old king, but you must remember that Titty-Tee-Hoo-Choo has deprived me of all my magic powers. However, I never took the trouble to learn just how to break the charm I cast over Shaggy's brother, for I intended he should always remain ugly. Every charm, remarked pretty Polychrome, has its antidote, and if you knew this charm of ugliness, Ruggedo, you must have known how to dispel it. He shook his head. If I did, I've forgotten, he stammered regretfully. Try to think, pleaded Shaggy anxiously. Please try to think. Ruggedo ruffled his hair with both hands, sighed, slapped his chest, rubbed his ear, and stared stupidly around the group. I have a faint recollection that there was one thing that would break the charm, said he, but misfortune has so addled my brain that I can't remember what it was. See here, Ruggedo, said Betsy sharply, we've treated you pretty well so far, but we won't stand for any nonsense, and if you know what's good for yourself, you'll think of that charm. Why? He demanded, turning to look wonderingly at the little girl. Because it means so much to Shaggy's brother. He's dreadfully ashamed of himself the way he is now, and you're to blame for it. Fact is, Ruggedo, you've done so much wickedness in your life that it won't hurt you to do a kind act now. Ruggedo blinked at her and sighed again, and then tried very hard to think. I seem to remember, dimly, said he, that a certain kind of a kiss will break the charm of ugliness. What kind of a kiss? What kind? Why, it was either the kiss of a mortal maid, or the kiss of a mortal maid who had once been a fairy, or the kiss of one who is still a fairy. I can't remember which, but of course no maid, mortal or fairy, would ever consent to kiss a person so ugly, so dreadfully, fearfully, terribly ugly as Shaggy's brother. I'm not so sure of that, said Betsy with admirable courage. I'm a mortal maid, and if it is my kiss that will break this awful charm, I'll do it. Oh, you really couldn't, protested Ugly. I would be obliged to remove my mask, and when you saw my face, nothing could induce you to kiss me, generous as you are. Well, as for that, said the little girl, I needn't see your face at all. Here's my plan. You stay in this dark passage, and we'll send away the gnomes with their torches. Then you'll take off the handkerchief, and I'll kiss you. This is awfully kind of you, Betsy, said Shaggy gratefully. Well, it surely won't kill me, she replied, and if it makes you and your brother happy, I'm willing to take some chances. So Calico ordered the torch-bearers to leave the passage, which they did by going through the rock opening. Queen Anne and her army also went out, but the others were so interested in Betsy's experiment that they remained grouped at the mouth of the passageway. When the big rock swung into place, closing tight the opening, they were left in total darkness. Now then, called Betsy in a cheerful voice, have you got that handkerchief off your face, Ugly? Yes, he replied. Well, where are you then? She asked, reaching out her arms. Here, said he. You'll have to stoop down, you know. He found her hands, and clasping them in his own, stooped until his face was near to that of the little girl. The others heard a clear, smacking kiss, and then Betsy exclaimed, There, I've done it, and it didn't hurt a bit. Tell me, dear brother, is the charm broken? Asked Shaggy. I do not know, was the reply. It may be, or it may not be. I cannot tell. Has anyone a match? Inquired Betsy. I have several, said Shaggy. Then let Ruggedo strike one of them and look at your brother's face while we all turn our backs. Ruggedo made your brother ugly, so I guess he can stand the horror of looking at him if the charm isn't broken. Agreeing to this, Ruggedo took the match and lighted it. He gave one look and then blew out the match. Ugly as ever, he said with a shudder. So it wasn't the kiss of a mortal maid after all. Let me try, proposed the Rose Princess in her sweet voice. I am a mortal maid who was once a fairy, but perhaps my kiss will break the charm. Files did not wholly approve of this, but he was too generous to interfere. So the Rose Princess felt her way through the darkness to Shaggy's brother and kissed him. Ruggedo struck another match while they all turned away. No, announced the former king, that didn't break the charm either. It must be the kiss of a fairy that is required, or else my memory has failed me altogether. Polly, said Betsy pleadingly, won't you try? Of course I will, answered Polychrome with a merry laugh. I've never kissed a mortal man in all the thousands of years I have existed. But I'll do it to please our faithful Shaggy Man, whose unselfish affection for his ugly brother deserves to be rewarded. Even as Polychrome was speaking, she tripped lightly to the side of the ugly one and quickly touched his cheek with her lips. Oh, thank you, he fervently cried. I've changed this time, I know. I can feel it. I'm different. Shaggy, dear Shaggy, I am myself again. Files, who was near the opening, touched the spring that released the big rock, and it suddenly swung backward and let in a flood of daylight. Everyone stood motionless, staring hard at Shaggy's brother, who, no longer masked by the polka-dot handkerchief, met their gaze with a glad smile. Well, said Shaggy Man, breaking the silence at last, and drawing a long, deep breath of satisfaction, You are no longer the ugly one, my dear brother. But to be entirely frank with you, the face that belongs to you is no more handsome than it ought to be." "I think he's rather good-looking," remarked Betsy, gazing at the man critically. "In comparison with what he was," said King Calico, "he is really beautiful. You who never beheld his ugliness may not understand that, but it was my misfortune to look at the ugly one many times, and I say again that in comparison with what he was, the man is now beautiful." "All right," returned Betsy briskly. "We'll take your word for it, Calico. And now let us get out of this tunnel and into the world again." End of Chapter 22. Kindly Kisses. Recording by Ada Kerman, Portland, Oregon, USA. 23 of Tik-Tok of Oz. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ada Kerman. Tik-Tok of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 23, Ruggedo Reforms. Ruggedo Reforms. It did not take them long to regain the royal cavern of the Gnome King, where Calico ordered served to them the nicest refreshments the place afforded. Ruggedo had come trailing along after the rest of the party, and while no one paid any attention to the old king, they did not offer any objection to his presence, or command him to leave them. He looked fearfully to see if the eggs were still guarding the entrance, but they had now disappeared, so he crept into the cavern after the others and humbly squatted down in a corner of the room. There Betsy discovered him. All of the little girl's companions were now so happy at the success of Shaggy's quest for his brother, and the laughter and merriment seemed so general, that Betsy's heart softened toward the friendless old man who had once been their bitter enemy, and she carried to him some of the food and drink. Ruggedo's eyes filled with tears at this unexpected kindness. He took the child's hand in his own and pressed it gratefully. "Look here, Calico," said Betsy, addressing the new king. "What's the use of being hard on Ruggedo? All his magic power is gone, so he can't do any more harm, and I'm sure he's sorry he acted so badly to everybody." "Are you?" asked Calico, looking down at his former master. "I am," said Ruggedo. "The girl speaks truly. I'm sorry, and I'm harmless. I don't want to wander through the wide world on top of the ground, for I'm a gnome. No gnome can ever be happy any place but underground." "That being the case," said Calico, "I will let you stay here as long as you behave yourself. But if you try to act badly again, I shall drive you out, as Titty-Hoochoo has commanded, and you'll have to wander." "Never fear, I'll behave," promised Ruggedo. "It is hard work being a king, and harder still to be a good king. But now that I am a common gnome, I am sure I can lead a blameless life." They were all pleased to hear this, and to know that Ruggedo had really reformed. "I hope he'll keep his word," whispered Betsy to Shaggy. "But if he gets bad again, we will be far away from the Gnome Kingdom, and Calico will have to tend to the old gnome himself." Polychrome had been a little restless during the last hour or two. The lovely daughter of the Rainbow knew that she had now done all in her power to assist her earth friends, and so she began to long for her sky home. "I think," she said, after listening intently, "that it is beginning to rain. The Rain King is my uncle, you know, and perhaps he has read my thoughts and is going to help me. Anyway, I must take a look at the sky and make sure." So she jumped up and ran through the passage to the outer entrance, and they all followed after her and grouped themselves on a ledge of the mountainside. Sure enough, dark clouds had filled the sky, and a slow drizzling rain had set in. "It can't last for long," said Shaggy, looking upward, "and when it stops we shall lose the sweet little fairy we have learned to love. Alas," he continued after a moment, "the clouds are already breaking in the west, and see, isn't that the rainbow coming?" Betsy didn't look at the sky. She looked at Polychrome, whose happy, smiling face surely foretold the coming of her father to take her to the cloud palaces. A moment later a gleam of sunshine flooded the mountain, and a gorgeous rainbow appeared. With a cry of gladness, Polychrome sprang upon a point of rock and held out her arms. Straightway the rainbow descended until its end was at her very feet, when with a graceful leap she sprang upon it, and was at once clasped in the arms of her radiant sisters, the daughters of the rainbow. But Polychrome released herself to lean over the edge of the glowing arch and nod, and smile and throw a dozen kisses to her late comrades. "Goodbye," she called, and they all shouted "Goodbye" in return and waved their hands to their pretty friend. Slowly the magnificent bow lifted and melted into the sky, until the eyes of the earnest watchers saw only fleecy clouds flitting across the blue. "I'm dreadful sorry to see Polychrome go," said Betsy, who felt like crying, "but I s'pose she'll be a good deal happier with her sisters in the sky palaces." "To be sure," returned Shaggy, nodding gravely. "It's her home, you know, and those poor wanderers who, like ourselves, have no home, can realize what that means to her." "Once," said Betsy, "I too had a home. Now I've only dear old Hank." She twined her arms around her shaggy friend who was not human, and he said hee-haw in a tone that showed he understood her mood. And the shaggy friend who was human stroked the child's head tenderly and said, "You're wrong about that, Betsy dear. I will never desert you." "Nor I," exclaimed Shaggy's brother in earnest tones. The little girl looked up at them gratefully, and her eyes smiled through their tears. "All right," she said. "It's raining again, so let's go back into the cavern." Rather soberly, for all loved Polychrome and would miss her, they re-entered the dominions of the Gnome King. End of Chapter 23, Ruggido Reforms.
Chapter 24, Tik-Tok of Oz. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Lucy Burgoyne. Tik-Tok of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 24. Dorothy is delighted. "Well," said Queen Anne, when all were again seated in Calico's royal cabin, "I wonder what we shall do next. If I could find my way back to Oogaboo, I'd take my army home at once, for I'm sick and tired of these dreadful hardships." "Don't you want to conquer the world?" asked Betsy. "No, I've changed my mind about that," admitted the Queen. "The world is too big for one person to conquer, and I was happier with my own people in Oogaboo. I wish, oh, how earnestly I wish, that I was back there this minute." "So do I," yelled every officer in a fervent tone. Now, it is time for the reader to know that in the faraway land of Oz the lovely ruler, Ozma, had been following the adventures of her Shaggy Man, and Tik-Tok, and all the others they had met. Day by day Ozma, with the wonderful Wizard of Oz seated beside her, had gazed upon a magic picture in a radium frame, which occupied one side of the ruler's cozy boudoir in the palace of the Emerald City. The singular thing about this magic picture was that it showed whatever scene Ozma wished to see, with the figures all in motion, just as it was taking place. So Ozma and the Wizard had watched every action of the adventures from the time Shaggy had met shipwrecked Betsy and Hank in the Rose Kingdom, at which time the Rose Princess, a distant cousin of Ozma, had been exiled by her heartless subjects. When Anne and her people so earnestly wished to return to Oogaboo, Ozma was sorry for them and remembered that Oogaboo was a corner of the land of Oz. She turned to her attendant and asked, "Can not your magic take these unhappy people to their old home, Wizard?" "It can, your Highness," replied the little Wizard. "I think the poor Queen has suffered enough in her misguided effort to conquer the world," said Ozma, smiling at the absurdity of the undertaking. "So no doubt she will hereafter be contented in her own little kingdom. Please send her there, Wizard, and with her the officers and files." "How about the Rose Princess?" asked the Wizard. "Send her to Oogaboo with files," answered Ozma. "They have become such good friends that I am sure it would make them unhappy to separate them." "Very well," said the Wizard, and without any fuss or mystery whatever he performed a magical rite that was simply and effective. Therefore those seated in the Gnome King's cabin were both startled and amazed when all the people of Oogaboo suddenly disappeared from the room, and with them the Rose Princess. At first they could not understand it at all, but presently Shaggy suspected the truth, and believing that Ozma was now taking an interest in the party, he drew from his pocket a tiny instrument which he placed against his ear. Ozma, observing this action in her magic picture, at once caught up a similar instrument from a table beside her and held it to her own ear. The two instruments recorded the same delicate vibrations of sound and formed a wireless telephone, an invention of the Wizard. Those separated by any distance were thus enabled to converse together with perfect ease and without any wire connection. "Do you hear me, Shaggy Man?" asked Ozma. "Yes, your Highness," he replied. "I have sent the people of Oogaboo back to their own little valley," announced the ruler of Oz, "so do not worry over their disappearance." "That was very kind of you," said Shaggy, "but your Highness must permit me to report that my own mission here is now ended. I have found my lost brother, and he is now beside me, freed from the enchantment of ugliness which Ruggedo cast upon him. Tik-Tok has served me and my comrades faithfully, as you requested him to do, and I hope you will now transport the Clockwork Man back to your fairyland of Oz." "I will do that," replied Ozma, "but how about yourself, Shaggy?" "I have been very happy in Oz," he said, "but my duty to others forces me to exile myself from that delightful land. I must take care of my new found brother, for one thing, and I have a new comrade in a dear little girl named Betsy Bobbin, who has no home to go to, and no other friends but me and a small donkey named Hank. I have promised Betsy never to desert her as long as she needs a friend, and so I must give up the delights of the land of Oz forever." He said this with a sigh of regret, and Ozma made no reply but laid the tiny instrument on her table, thus cutting off all further communication with the Shaggy Man. But the lovely ruler of Oz still watched her magic picture, with a thoughtful expression upon her face, and the little Wizard of Oz watched Ozma and smiled softly to himself. In the cabin of the Gnome King Shaggy replaced the wireless telephone in his pocket, and turning to Betsy said in as cheerful a voice as he could muster, "Well, little comrade, what shall we do next?" "I don't know, I'm sure," she answered with a puzzled face. "I'm kind of sorry our adventures are over, for I enjoyed them. And now that Queen Anne and her people are gone, and Polychrome is gone, and dear me, where's Tik-Tok, Shaggy?" "He also has disappeared," said Shaggy, looking around the cabin and nodding wisely. "By this time he is in Ozma's palace, in the land of Oz, which is his home." "Isn't it your home, too?" asked Betsy. "It used to be, my dear, but now my home is wherever you and my brother are. We are wanderers, you know, but if we stick together, I am sure we shall have a good time." "Then," said the girl, "let us get out of this stuffy, underground cabin and go in search of new adventures. I'm sure it has stopped raining." "I'm ready," said Shaggy, and then they bade good bye to King Calico, and thanked him for his assistance, and went out to the mouth of the passage. The sky was now clear and a brilliant blue in color. The sun shone brightly, and even this rugged, rocky country seemed delightful after their confinement underground. There were but four of them now, Betsy and Hank, and Shaggy and his brother, and the little party made their way down the mountain, and followed a faint path that led toward the southwest. During this time Ozma had been holding a conference with the Wizard, and later with Tik-Tok, whom the magic of the Wizard had quickly transported to Ozma's palace. Tik-Tok had only words of praise for Betsy Bobbin, who, he said, is almost as nice as Dorothy herself. "Let us send for Dorothy," said Ozma, and summoning her favorite maid, who was named Jellia Jam, she asked her to request Princess Dorothy to attend her at once. So a few moments later Dorothy entered Ozma's room, and greeted her and the Wizard and Tik-Tok with the same gentle smile and simple manner that had won for the little girl the love of every one she met. "Did you want to see me, Ozma?" she asked. "Yes, dear. I am puzzled how to act, and I want your advice." "I don't believe it's worth much," replied Dorothy, "but I'll do the best I can. What is it all about, Ozma?" "You all know," said the girl ruler, addressing her three friends, "what a serious thing it is to admit any mortals into this fairyland of Oz. It is true I have invited several mortals to make their home here, and all of them have proved true and loyal subjects. Indeed, no one of you three was a native of Oz. Dorothy and the Wizard came here from the United States, and Tik-Tok came from the land of Ev. But of course he is not a mortal. Shaggy is another American, and he is the cause of all my worry, for our dear Shaggy will not return here and desert the new friends he has found in his recent adventures, because he believes they need his services." "Shaggy Man was always kind-hearted," remarked Dorothy, "but who are these new friends he has found?" "One is his brother, who for many years has been a prisoner of the Gnome King, our old enemy Raggedo. This brother seems a kindly, honest fellow, but he has done nothing to entitle him to a home in the land of Oz." "Who else?" asked Dorothy. "I have told you about Betsy Bobbin, the little girl who was shipwrecked, in much the same way you once were, and has since been following the Shaggy Man in his search for his lost brother. You remember her, do you not?" "Oh, yes!" exclaimed Dorothy. "I've often watched her and Hank in the magic picture, you know. She's a dear little girl, and old Hank is a darling. Where are they now?" "Look and see," replied Ozma with a smile at her friend's enthusiasm. Dorothy turned to the picture, which showed Betsy and Hank, with Shaggy and his brother, trudging along the rocky paths of a barren country. "Seems to me," she said, musingly, "that they're a good way from any place to sleep, or any nice things to eat." "You are right," said Tik-Tok. "I have been in that country, and it is a wilderness." "It is the country of the Gnomes," explained the Wizard, "who are so mischievous that no one cares to live near them. I'm afraid Shaggy and his friends will endure many hardships before they get out of that rocky place, unless—" he turned to Ozma and smiled. "Unless I ask you to transport them all here?" she asked. "Yes, your Highness." "Could your magic do that?" inquired Dorothy. "I think so," said the Wizard. "Well," said Dorothy, "as far as Betsy and Hank are concerned, I'd like to have them here in Oz. It would be such fun to have a girl playmate of my own age, you see. And Hank is such a dear little mule." Ozma laughed at the wistful expression in the girl's eyes, and then she drew Dorothy to her and kissed her. "Am I not your friend and playmate?" she asked. Dorothy flushed. "You know how dearly I love you, Ozma," she cried. "But you're so busy ruling all this land of Oz that we can't always be together." "I know, dear. My first duty is to my subjects, and I think it would be a delight to us all to have Betsy with us. There's a pretty suite of rooms just opposite your own where she can live, and I'll build a golden stall for Hank in the stable where the Sawhorse lives. Then we'll introduce the mule to the Cowardly Lion and the Hungry Tiger, and I'm sure they will all soon become firm friends. But I cannot very well admit Betsy and Hank into Oz unless I also admit Shaggy's brother." "And, unless you admit Shaggy's brother, you will keep out poor Shaggy, whom we are all very fond of," said the Wizard. "Well, why not admit him?" demanded Tik-Tok. "The land of Oz is not a refuge for all mortals in distress," explained Ozma. "I do not wish to be unkind to Shaggy Man, but his brother has no claim on me." "The land of Oz isn't crowded," suggested Dorothy. "Then you advise me to admit Shaggy's brother?" inquired Ozma. "Well, we can't afford to lose our Shaggy Man, can we?" "No, indeed," returned Ozma. "What do you say, Wizard?" "I'm getting my magic ready to transport them all." "And you, Tik-Tok?" "Shaggy's brother is a good fellow, and we can't spare Shaggy. So then, the question is settled," decided Ozma. "Perform your magic, Wizard." He did so, placing a silver plate upon a small standard and pouring upon the plate a small quantity of pink powder which was contained in a crystal vial. Then he muttered a rather difficult incantation, which the sorceress Glinda the Good had taught him, and it all ended in a puff of perfume smoke from the silver plate. This smoke was so pungent that it made both Ozma and Dorothy rub their eyes for a moment. "You must pardon these disagreeable fumes," said the Wizard. "I assure you the smoke is a very necessary part of my wizardry." "Look!" cried Dorothy, pointing to the magic picture. "They're gone! All of them are gone!" Indeed, the picture now showed the same rocky landscape as before, but the three people and the mule had disappeared from it. "They are gone," said the Wizard, polishing the silver plate and wrapping it in a fine cloth, "because they are here." At that moment Jellia Jam entered the room. "Your Highness," she said to Ozma, "the Shaggy Man and another man are in the waiting room, and asked to pay their respects to you. Shaggy is crying like a baby, but he says they are tears of joy." "Send them here at once, Jellia," commanded Ozma. "Also," continued the maid, "a girl and a small sized mule have mysteriously arrived, but they don't seem to know where they are or how they came here. Shall I send them here, too?" "Oh, no!" exclaimed Dorothy, eagerly jumping up from her chair. "I'll go to meet Betsy myself, for she'll feel awful strange in this big palace." And she ran down the stairs two at a time to greet her new friend, Betsy Bobbin. End of chapter 24. Chapter 25. Tik-Tok of Oz. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Lucy Burgoyne. Tik-Tok of Oz by L. Frank Baum. Chapter 25. The Land of Love. "Well, is hee-haw all you are able to say?" inquired the Sawhorse, as he examined Hank with his knot eyes and slowly wagged the branch that served him for a tail. They were in a beautiful stable in the rear of Ozma's palace, where the wooden Sawhorse, very much alive, lived in a golden panelled stall, and where there were rooms for the Cowardly Lion and the Hungry Tiger, which were filled with soft cushions for them to lie upon and golden troughs for them to eat from. Beside the stall of the Sawhorse had been placed another for Hank, the mule. This was not quite so beautiful as the other, for the Sawhorse was Ozma's favorite steed, but Hank had a supply of cushions for a bed, which the Sawhorse did not need because he never slept. And all this luxury was so strange to the little mule that he could only stand still and regard his surroundings and his queer companions with wonder and amazement. The Cowardly Lion, looking very dignified, was stretched out upon the marble floor of the stable, eyeing Hank with a calm and critical gaze, while nearby crouched the huge Hungry Tiger, who seemed equally interested in the new animal that had just arrived. The Sawhorse, standing stiffly before Hank, repeated his question. "Is hee-haw all you are able to say?" Hank moved his ears in an embarrassed manner. "I have never said anything else until now," he replied, and then he began to tremble with fright to hear himself talk. "I can well understand that," remarked the lion, wagging his great head with a swaying motion. "Strange things happen in this land of Oz, as they do everywhere else. I believe you came here from the cold, civilized, outside world, did you not?" "I did," replied Hank. "One minute I was outside of Oz, and the next minute I was inside. That was enough to give me a nervous shock, as you may guess, but to find myself able to talk, as Betsy does, is a marvel that staggers me." "That is because you are in the land of Oz," said the Sawhorse. "All animals talk, in this favored country, and you must admit it. It is more sociable than to bray your dreadful hee-haw, which nobody can understand." "Mules understand it very well," declared Hank. "Oh, indeed. Then there must be other mules in your outside world," said the tiger, yawning sleepily. "There are a great many in America," said Hank. "Are you the only tiger in Oz?" "No," acknowledged the tiger. "I have many relatives living in the jungle country, but I am the only tiger living in the Emerald City." "There are other lions, too," said the Sawhorse, "but I am the only horse, of any description, in this favored land." "That is why this land is favored," said the tiger. "You must understand, friend Hank, that the Sawhorse puts on airs because he is shod with plates of gold, and because our beloved ruler, Ozma of Oz, likes to ride upon his back." "Betsy rides upon my back," declared Hank proudly. "Who is Betsy?" "The dearest, sweetest girl in all the world." The Sawhorse gave an angry snort and stamped his golden feet. The tiger crouched and growled. Slowly the great lion rose to his feet, his mane bristling. "Friend Hank," said he, "either you are mistaken in judgment or you are wilfully trying to deceive us. The dearest, sweetest girl in the world is our Dorothy, and I will fight anyone, animal or human, who dares to deny it." "So will I," snarled the tiger, showing 2 rows of enormous white teeth. "You are all wrong," asserted the Sawhorse in a voice of scorn. "No girl living can compare with my mistress, Ozma of Oz." Hank slowly turned around until his heels were toward the others. Then he said stubbornly: "I am not mistaken in my statement, nor will I admit there can be a sweeter girl alive than Betsy Bobbin. If you want to fight, come on, I'm ready for you." While they hesitated, eyeing Hank's heels doubtfully, a merry peal of laughter startled the animals, and turning their heads, they beheld 3 lovely girls standing just within the richly carved entrance to the stable. In the center was Ozma, her arms encircling the waists of Dorothy and Betsy, who stood on either side of her. Ozma was nearly half a head taller than the 2 other girls, who were almost of one size. Unobserved, they had listened to the talk of the animals, which was a very strange experience indeed to little Betsy Bobbin. "You foolish beasts!" exclaimed the ruler of Oz, in a gentle but chiding voice. "Why should you fight to defend us, who are all 3 loving friends, and in no sense rivals? Answer me," she continued, as they bowed their heads sheepishly. "I have the right to express my opinion, your Highness," pleaded the lion. "And so have the others," replied Ozma. "I am glad you and the hungry tiger love Dorothy best, for she was your first friend and companion. Also I am pleased that my Sawhorse loves me best, for together we have endured both joy and sorrow. Hank has proved his faith and loyalty by defending his own little mistress. And so you are all right in one way, but wrong in another. Our land of Oz is a land of love, and here friendship outranks every other quality. Unless you can all be friends, you cannot retain our love." They accepted this rebuke very meekly. "All right," said the Sawhorse, quite cheerfully. "Shake hoofs, friend mule." Hank touched his hoof to that of the wooden horse. "Let us be friends and rub noses," said the tiger. So Hank modestly rubbed noses with the big beast. The lion merely nodded and said, as he crouched before the mule: "Any friend of our beloved ruler is a friend of the Cowardly Lion. That seems to cover your case. If ever you need help or advice, friend Hank, call on me." "Why, this is as it should be," said Ozma, highly pleased to see them so fully reconciled. Then she turned to her companions. "Come, my dears, let us resume our walk." As they turned away, Betsy said wonderingly: "Do all the animals in Oz talk as we do?" "Almost all," answered Dorothy. "There's a yellow hen here, and she can talk, and so can her chickens, and there's a pink kitten upstairs in my room who talks very nicely. But I've a little fuzzy black dog named Toto, who has been with me in Oz a long time, and he's never said a single word but bow wow." "Do you know why?" asked Ozma. "Why, he's a Kansas dog. I suppose he's different from these fairy animals," replied Dorothy. "Hank isn't a fairy animal, any more than Toto," said Ozma. "Yet as soon as he came under the spell of our fairyland he found he could talk. It was the same with Billina, the yellow hen whom you brought here at one time." The same spell has affected Toto, I assure you, but he's a wise little dog, and while he knows everything that is said to him, he prefers not to talk." "Goodness me!" exclaimed Dorothy. "I never suspected Toto was fooling me all this time." Then she drew a small silver whistle from her pocket and blew a shrill note upon it. A moment later there was a sound of scurrying footsteps, and a shaggy black dog came running up the path. Dorothy knelt down before him, and shaking her finger just above his nose, she said, "Toto, haven't I always been good to you?" Toto looked up at her with his bright black eyes and wagged his tail. "Bow wow," he said, and Betsy knew at once that meant yes, as well as Dorothy and Ozma knew it, for there was no mistaking the tone of Toto's voice. "That's a dog answer," said Dorothy. "How would you like it, Toto, if I said nothing to you but bow wow?" Toto's tail was wagging furiously now, but otherwise he was silent. "Really, Dorothy," said Betsy, "he can talk with his bark and his tail just as well as we can. Don't you understand such dog language?" "Of course I do," replied Dorothy. "But Toto's got to be more sociable. See here, sir," she continued, addressing the dog, "I've just learned, for the first time, that you can say words, if you want to. Don't you want to, Toto?" "Woof!" said Toto, and that meant no. "Not just one word, Toto, to prove you're as any other animal in Oz?" "Woof!" "Just one word, Toto, and then you may run away." He looked at her steadily a moment. "All right, here I go," he said, and darted away as swift as an arrow. Dorothy clapped her hands in delight, while Betsy and Ozma both laughed heartily at her pleasure and the success of her experiment. Arm in arm they sauntered away through the beautiful gardens of the palace, where magnificent flowers bloomed in abundance, and fountains shot their silvery sprays far into the air. And by, as they turned a corner, they came upon Shaggy Man and his brother, who were seated together upon a golden bench. The two arose to bow respectfully as the ruler of Oz approached them. "How are you enjoying our land of Oz?" Ozma asked the stranger. "I am very happy here, your Highness," replied Shaggy's brother. "Also I am very grateful to you for permitting me to live in this delightful place." "You must thank Shaggy for that," said Ozma. "Being his brother, I have made you welcome here." "When you know brother better," said Shaggy earnestly, "you will be glad he has become one of your loyal subjects. I am just getting acquainted with him myself, and I find much in his character to admire." Leaving the brothers, Ozma and the girls continued their walk. Presently Betsy exclaimed: "Shaggy's brother can't ever be as happy in Oz as I am. Do you know, Dorothy, I didn't believe any girl could ever have such a good time, anywhere, as I am having now." "I know," answered Dorothy. "I felt that way myself, lots of times." "I wish," continued Betsy dreamily, "that every little girl in the world could live in the land of Oz, and every little boy, too." Ozma laughed at this. "It is quite fortunate for us, Betsy, that your wish cannot be granted," said she, "for all that army of girls and boys would crowd us so that we would have to move away." "Yes," agreed Betsy, after a little thought, "I guess that's true." End of Tik-Tok of Oz by L. Frank Baum.